Ecclesiastes 7. We are starting a new section on the book today. It's actually got a completely different tone than the first half. Ecclesiastes is divided into two different sections, 6 chapters each. Some scholars have even speculated that they were written at two separate times, that perhaps the first half was written at an earlier period in Solomon's life, and the last half was written later on. And the whole tone of the book is completely different. The first half that we've been going through over the last couple of weeks and even months, it has been very much loud and brash and boisterous. Maybe you could picture it as a preacher. He actually calls himself a preacher several times, standing up in front of a crowd of people and talking and explaining things and just preaching, basically the same way I do. But the second half of the book is very much different. It's kind of quiet. It's kind of muted a little bit. It's kind of not so much as though you're reading it like the words of a preacher, but the words of an old grandpa that's just sitting across the table from somebody, pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee, and he just wants to explain a couple of lessons that he's learned through his life and through his experiences. It's not loud, it's not boisterous, it's very calm and very reassuring, and it's full of wisdom. Over the last several weeks, Pastor Lou has been getting together with me over on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights, just coming a little bit early and talking to me about a couple of things and just giving me some wisdom, giving me some advice, because he's been through this a long time. He's been doing these ministries for a very, very long time, and he knows a lot of stuff that I certainly don't, and I really appreciate all this stuff. Last Wednesday night, he was coming over, and Lois actually invited us over for chicken and biscuits. She wanted to have us over for dinner on Wednesday night, and I told her, well, no, I can't do that because Pastor Lou's coming over, and he's going to be talking about some things. I didn't know what he was going to talk about. Apparently, word got out that he was coming, and he was giving me a talking to. He had some things he wanted me to know. And so Doug called me the next day, and he said, are you okay? I heard Pastor Lou was coming by to give you a talking to. But it never is like that at all. He's not trying to bash me over the head or anything silly like that. He's just trying to explain a couple of things and give me a little bit of help, give me some pointers, give me some tips, because he's been through this, and he's learned and he's experienced things, and in some ways he may have learned it the hard way. And Solomon certainly did. Solomon had a PhD in the School of Hard Knocks. He learned life the hard way, and he's got a lot of tips and he's got a lot of tricks and things that he wants to pass along to the next generation. And that's what the next half of the book is really all about. So don't read it as though it's the words of a preacher, but look at it as though it's the words of a grandpa just pulling up a chair with a cup of coffee and sitting there on the front porch for several hours and just explaining some of the life lessons that he's learned. As such, I don't know if you've ever heard, if you've ever talked to an older person, but they don't always have the most coherent message. And I don't necessarily say that to be critical of them or to make fun of them in any way, but it's true. And he's giving these not as a message, not as a sermon, but almost as simple sentence sermons like Proverbs. Solomon wrote the entire book of Proverbs as far as we know, and the last half of the book of Ecclesiastes could very well fit in there. But the problem with preaching through a passage like this is that it's hard to come up with a coherent message. It's hard to come up with one clear idea that ties it all together. And today we're going to be looking at the first 14 verses of chapter 7, and it's kind of jumbled, it's kind of all over the place, but if there's one key theme that I could draw out of it, it's about finishing well. Because Solomon here is getting to the very end of his life. We've said that through the first half of the book. He's obviously older, he's obviously experienced, he's seen everything, he's done everything, and he's come to a point in the conclusion where he understands that life is meaningless, life is purposeless apart from God, under the sun. And here in the last half, he's very, very much older, and he's seen it all, he's experienced it all, and he's just wanting to share a couple of the messages and a couple of the ideas in the sentence sermons. You can boil all these ideas and all these concepts down to their rarest form, down to the point where you can call them irreducible truths, where you can't say it any more simply, you can't say it any more clearly, and it's very, very simple and very, very clear. I've got another outline for you this morning to fill out. Do you guys like doing these? I really don't know. I'm not getting much of any kind of feedback, but if you like having something to follow along with and fill out, I know for my sake it's easier because it gives me something to follow along with, and I don't get off track quite so easily. Anyway, so we are in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter number 7. Begin reading in verse number 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than the beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. If you're following along, if you're filling out the outline with me this morning, the first couple of points that I'm going to make, number one, funerals are better than parties. Solomon is getting ready for his own funeral here. As many people do when they approach the end days of their life, they're starting to think about what's going to happen at their own funeral, what's going to happen when they're gone. He says in verse number 1 that a good name is better than precious ointment. Throughout this this proverb here, these first 14 verses, he used the word better 8 times. He's comparing and contrasting things. And the first one that he says is that a good name is better than precious ointment. And he's looking at his own funeral, and he's probably been to many, many funerals for all of his friends and his family members and people through the years. And funerals were a little bit different then than they are now, but in a lot of ways they were very similar. What happens when somebody dies? Well, we do a little bit to preserve their body. We make them smell real good. We put nice clothes on them. We paint them up like a circus clown. We put them in a really nice box, and we put them in the ground. And it's pretty much similar to what it was back then. That precious ointment that he's talking about there could have been used just as an underarm deodorant. They would use it in that sense if they were wealthy and they could afford it. But the majority of the time that this was used, it was used to preserve and to make a body smell better after it had died. And what Solomon is saying here is that a good name is more valuable than that precious ointment. What's the point that he's trying to make? He says, listen, it doesn't matter what you smell like when you're dead if your life stinks. He says if your name, your reputation, your character, what you're known for, your ethics, if people roll their eyes when they hear your name, then it doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter what you smell like. Your character, your name, what you're known for is worth so much more than that. Have you ever been to a funeral where you could tell people were just kind of struggling to have one nice thing to say about the deceased? I have. And it's not a good place to be. No matter what we might do to try to make them look good, make them smell good, try to pretend, we give them nice flowers, and we put on a great big meal, and we do all these things to try to celebrate the life, and we try to come up with some nice things to say about the deceased. Ultimately, their life and their reputation says a whole lot more about what they were like than what we did to them after they died. And Solomon is saying, look, there's going to come a point in everybody's life when you're going to be dead, when your life is going to be over. And there are no do-overs. You're not going to have a second chance. You're not going to have any ability to change your life and to change your reputation. It's over. It's done. And you're living your life in such a way that at the end of your life, when it's all over, when it's said and done, what are people going to say about you? What is your reputation? What is your name going to be worth? He says we put way too much emphasis on trying to make people look good in their death rather than us trying to make ourselves look good in life. A good name is better than precious ointment. And then he continues, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. And this is very counter-intellectual. He says, listen, the day of death is better than one's birth? Well, what is that? That doesn't even make sense. Why would we don't celebrate the day of one's death. We celebrate birthdays, right? And we celebrate the beginning of new life. When a baby comes, that is a joyous celebration. When somebody dies, that's a terrible thing. We don't like to think about death. We don't like to celebrate death. But what is he saying? He's saying that birth is all about hope and about expectation. It's about promise. It's about potential. But what is death about? Death is about fulfillment, especially for Christians, especially for those of us that know Jesus Christ as our personal Savior. Death is a reward. Death is a good thing because we're going to be with Jesus. Death is a gift for those of us that know the Lord as our personal Savior. He says the day of birth, that's good, but the day of death is so much better because it's a day of fulfillment. It's a day of completion. I personally believe that God has a purpose for every single one of our lives. He's got something for you to do today, tomorrow, every day until the day you die. And when he's finally done with you, when he's done with your life's purpose, when you've done what God has put you on this earth to do, I believe it's over. I believe that it's done. I believe that's when God calls us home. I've talked to older people that say, I don't even know why God keeps me on this earth. I say, well, that's your job to figure out. You got to understand why God's keeping you here. You've got a purpose. You've got something that you are supposed to be doing. But when the day of death finally does come, that is God's way of telling you, listen, you have run the race with patience. You have fulfilled your task. You have kept the faith. You have finished well. That's what the whole idea here is. It's about finishing well. No matter what your life might look like through the years, when you finish well, when you finish the race with patience that is set before you, God says that the death of a saint is a good thing. It says in verse number 2, better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Funerals are better than parties, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. When you go to a funeral, you begin to consider your own mortality. You begin to understand that, you know what, I don't have forever to live. When you're young and handsome and virile like me, you can begin to think that, everything is going to be okay, that I've got the rest of my life to live and I can waste time now. No, you can't, because you have no idea how much time you have left. There is coming a day when you are going to be in that box, and you're not going to have a second chance. There's not going to be any do-overs. The way that you live each and every day is going to be reflected in the day of your birth, in the day of your death. We need to live in such a way that we know that that day is coming. We know that the day is coming when not only we're going to be in that box, but we're going to stand before God, and we're going to have to give an account. We're going to have to give an answer for the way that we've lived our life. He says a funeral is better than a party because that is the end of all men. We're all going to be there. And he says the living will take it to heart. We learn a lot about life when we think about death. It says in verse number 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Sorrow is better than laughter. He's not saying that laughter is bad. Obviously, that's not true. The Bible contradicts that many different times. He's not saying that laughter is bad. The Bible says that a merry heart doeth good like a medicine. It's good for us to laugh. I don't like people that don't like to laugh. But what he's saying here is that sorrow is also very important. I don't know about you, but there are people that just never take anything seriously, where they just anesthetize their own pain, and they just continue on. They do things that they ignore the issues of life. They never know how to grieve properly. And he says that by a sad countenance, the heart is made better. Sometimes you've got to grieve. Sometimes you've got to let go. Sometimes you've got to be in sorrow. Sometimes you've got to be in mourning in order for your heart to grow better, in order for your broken heart to be mended. This is what he's saying here. He's saying, listen, sometimes you got to let go. Sometimes you can't try to keep it all bottled in. You can't just amuse yourself and anesthetize yourself. That's what that word mirth literally means. We don't really talk about that word mirth anymore. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody say it. But what is it talking about? Literally, it means amusement. So many people's life is just like an amusement park where it's just one thrill ride after another. And we're spending all of our money and all of our time on useless, pointless games and buying stuff that we don't need and things that we just absolutely have no value. And we do this to amuse ourselves and to pretend like bad things don't happen and that we're not truly sad and that we don't have to deal with the stress and the frustrations of life. He says that a merry heart doeth good like a medicine in Proverbs, but here he contradicts that and he says that a sorrowful countenance makes one better. And then in verse number 2, if you're following along, the rebuke of the wise is better than the song of fools. Look at verse number 5. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. He uses the illustration here of you're trying to cook something over an open fire, and the only fuel that you've got, the only fire, the only wood that you've got is just this pile of thorns. It's like if you're just trying to burn a little bit of kindling. It's easy to start, it's easier to light, but it doesn't provide any heat. It might get something else caught very quickly, but if you've ever tried to burn a bunch of thistles and thorns, what does it do? It makes a lot of smoke, makes a lot of noise, but it doesn't provide any kind of heat. You can throw as many thorns and thistles and everything else under that fire as you want, but it's never going to be able to cook what's in the pot. He says, listen, the rebuke of a wise man is better than the song of fools. So many people live their life singing and dancing along and making melody in their hearts, but they never actually accomplish anything. He's saying the song of fools is like the thorns under that pot. They make a lot of noise, they make a lot of smoke, but they're not really accomplishing anything. He says it's better to be rebuked by a wise man. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like rebuke. I don't like somebody to come along and tell me that I'm wrong, that I'm messing up, that I'm doing something stupid, because I'm the smartest guy in the room all the time, right? I always do everything right, and when somebody comes along and they disagree with that, well, they're automatically wrong until they prove otherwise, and that's not easy to do. But we don't like rebuke. But what Solomon is saying here is that it's better to hear the rebuke of a wise man. And your rebuke has got to come out of wisdom, and it's got to come out of love. Let's be honest with that. If you're just somebody with a mouth and an opinion, that's not necessarily meaning that you are the rebuke of the wise. You've got to make sure that what you're saying and what you're sharing is coming out of a heart of wisdom and out of a heart of knowledge and out of a heart of love. There has been times in my life, let me just share this with you, where I have said things and I have rebuked somebody, and it was not out of a heart of love, and it was not out of a heart of wisdom. And how do you know the difference? How do you know whether it's time for you to say something, to speak up? Because I don't believe in holding it in. I don't believe if God has given you a message, I don't believe that you're supposed to hold it in. Maybe you should for a few minutes, but think about it. How are you supposed to know the difference? Well, for me, the rule of thumb that I've kind of accumulated over the last couple of months and years has been, if it annoys me, I probably shouldn't say anything. Is that fair? If I'm annoyed by it, it's probably not the time for me to say anything, for me to speak up. That's just the rule of thumb. Maybe I can't prove that from the Bible, but that's just my own personal belief. If you're annoyed by something, it's probably not out of wisdom that you're sharing it. Even if you stand behind what you said, even if you know that what you said is right, if you're saying it out of annoyance and frustration and you're angry at somebody, it's probably not the rebuke of the wise. And there are two things that we all need in order to grow, and those are encouragement and rebuke. If you don't have encouragement, you're not going to grow, but if you don't have rebuke, you're going to grow in all the wrong directions. If you really love somebody, you're going to keep them from making wrong choices, or at least you're going to try. You're going to encourage them to make the right choices, but you're going to rebuke them when they make the wrong choices. And you're going to tell them, look, you are making the wrong choice and you are messing up, and if you keep on doing this, then you're only going to screw your life up even worse. And then in verse number 7, it says, surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason. That word oppression there, if you look back in the Hebrew, it's really talking about pressure. A pressure destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. Pressure makes us do stupid stuff. It really does. When we're under pressure, even if you're a relatively intelligent person, you're going to be making dumb choices when you feel like you've got nowhere else to go. When you're backed into a corner and you have no idea what to do or where to turn, you're probably going to make a stupid choice. And that's why we need people that are full of wisdom and love and truth and knowledge to come along and share with us and tell us, listen, that is not the way that you should go. That is not what you should do. You need to make sure that you're not destroying your own reason because of the pressure that is all around you. And a bribe debases the heart. What is a bribe? It's basically an easy way out, right? It's the easiest way. If we can pay somebody off and make them say something and make them do something and pave the way for us to do what we want to do, usually a bribe is the easiest way to do it. But what Solomon is saying here is that a bribe is not the best way. The easy way is not always the best way to do things. Number 3, the future is better than the past. Verse number 8, the end of a thing is better than the beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. We all love to think about the good old days, remember? We like to think about the days in the past when life was simpler, when life was easier, maybe we had better relationships, maybe we had better money, maybe things are just a lot easier. And this is certainly true when you've been married for a couple of years, you think about the days that you were newlyweds. Maybe it's even not the good old days might not even be that long ago. My wife is constantly looking at our little boy and he's thinking, oh, he's getting so big. He was so small and he was so tiny and he was so easy to deal with when he was just so teeny tiny. And he's only gotten, 3 or 4 pounds bigger since he was born. But she looks at that and thinks that was the good old days. She is not going to make a good mom of a teenager, I'll tell you that much. She'll grow with him. But we look at the good old days, and we look at life when life was simple and life was easy and life was pleasant. And for me, it's easy to look back and think, we look at our life right now and all the things that make us miserable and make us unhappy now, and we think, well, we didn't have that back then. And that might be true, but we had our own problems back then. We had different problems. And we have this tendency to romanticize the past and pretend that it was better than it actually was. Because distance makes the heart grow fonder. And as farther away you get from the past and from everything that you've experienced before, the more you forget about the crap that went on back then. If we're truly honest with ourselves, the past was really not that much better than it is right now. When we were growing up, from the years I was like 7 to 12 years old, we lived on a dairy farm, and then my dad started his own business, hoof trimming, and so we moved into more of the suburbs and everything, and that was about the time I was 12 years old, and so within the next 5 years, there was 4 teenagers living at home at the same time. And for those of you that have experienced that, you know that those are not good days. Okay? You had 2 boys and 2 girls between the ages of like 13 and 17, and it was just a mess. It was a constant headache, and we hated it. And we thought, well, if we just got back to the farm, because those days were simple, and those days were easy, and we were younger, and we were cute, and we got along with each other. No, we didn't. Not really. Not if you think about it. And I kept on trying to tell my parents that. I said, it really wasn't that great back then either. Because mom was working full time and dad was working like 90 hours a week like you do on a dairy farm. And life was just miserable. It wasn't really much better then than it is now. I mean, there were good things then, but there are good things now. Solomon says it's not out of wisdom that you ask this. Why were the former days better than now? It's not wise for us to ask those things because it's not true. The former days were not really that much better than they are now. And most importantly of all, no matter what you do, you can't get back to the former days. You can't go back to the good old days. You can try as hard as you want to make the good old days like they are now or make the today like they were back then, but it's never going to happen. Why? Because you've changed, because your family's changed, because your circumstances have changed. You're never going to be able to get the good old days back. What should our focus be? Not on the past, but on the future. The future is always better. You can't change the past, but you can absolutely change the future. Your destiny is in your own hands and God's. We need to make sure that we're making the future as best and bright as we can possibly make it. I put in your notes here that if you try driving forward down the highway at 90 miles an hour, looking in the rearview mirror, you are going to wind up dead or in the hospital. But that's the way that so many of us live. We're constantly thinking about the past. We're constantly thinking about where we've been and why things are so terrible now because they were so great back then. No, they weren't. You need to have your eyes where you're going. You need to live your life as though what's ahead is much more important because it is than what was in the past. So many people, they don't live their life like the Indy 500 where they're focusing on going ahead and making that next left turn and the next left turn. Instead, they live their life like a demolition derby where they're just killing time and trying not to get killed. That's not the way our life is supposed to be lived. You need to focus on where you're going. You need to set yourself a goal and live intentionally and say, where am I going to be or where do I want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Where am I going to be then? Where do I want to be? What is my hope? What is my aspiration? Most importantly of all, where does God want me to be in 20 years or 5 years? And you need to set your sights and your focus on that and drive for it with all you've got. Because the future is always better than the past. When you've got God, not as your co-pilot, you see those stupid bumper stickers drive me crazy. If God is your co-pilot, you need to change seats. Okay? If you've got God guiding your steps and guiding your path, the future is always better. The future is always brighter. I believe that God is with us and God is for us, and He has got a better and brighter future for us than we could ever even imagine, but we've got to be willing to trust Him for that. Number 4, wisdom is better than wealth. Verse number 11, wisdom is good with a better word there. That's just a generic preposition there. But a better word would be wisdom is good as an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. There we go. Wisdom is good to those who have it. What is Solomon saying here? He's saying, listen, wisdom is good, money is good, and inheritance is good. Because if you give money to your kids, you give money to your relatives, you give an inheritance away, maybe you're dead, maybe you're not. It's good, because it basically solves a lot of their problems, right? You got 99 problems, and money would solve about 98 of them for most of us. But what he's saying here is that wisdom is a defense, money is a defense. It keeps bad things from happening. I was listening to Dave Ramsey this week. I've been kind of interested in what he has to say recently. And he was saying that, the most important thing, step number 1 in his 7 steps to financial freedom, I've got the set for you if you want to listen to it. The first step is not getting out of debt. The first step is getting $1,000 in the bank, which a lot of us don't have because he says if you get that $1,000 in the bank, Murphy goes away. He says bad things are less likely to happen to you if you've got money in the bank, if you've got the money to take care of it. I mean, how many of you have experienced this, where the only time that the transmission falls out of the car is when you don't have the money to pay for it, right? You know, the only time when you get sick and you got a bunch of hospital bills is when you don't have the money to pay for it. And he's saying, you know, it's not some spooky karma thing or anything like that. He's saying, listen, if you've got the money in the bank, bad things go away. Not necessarily, true universally, but in his experience and the, hundreds and thousands of people that he's helped over the years, they know that this is true. That when they've got the money in the bank and they've got this security fund, bad things are less likely to happen. And he's saying that, look, that money is a defense, and inheritance is a defense, but wisdom is also a defense. Because when you're wise, when you're living by wisdom and wise principles, and you're smart about things, stupid things and bad things are also less likely to happen. Now, once again, that's not universal. Bad things happen to smart people. Dumb things happen to wise people all the time. But he's saying that the difference between wisdom and money is that wisdom is the gift that keeps on giving. How many of you have given money to your kids and then 6 months later or 3 months later they come back for more, right? That's what happens all the time. I said last week, if you gave me $100,000, I could probably blow through it in a weekend without trying that hard. But what Solomon is saying here is that, look, money is a defense, wisdom is a defense, but wisdom is the gift that keeps on giving, because you give your kids wisdom, it's never going to run out. If they actually pick up on what you're putting down, if they actually take your wisdom, if they take your advice and they learn from it and they apply it to their lives, it's not going to run out. They're not going to have to come back for more later. It's not like it is the gift that keeps on giving. You're constantly going to have that wisdom, and you're going to be able to live by it, and you're going to be able to use it again and again and again and again. And he says the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Number 5, almost done. Verse number 13, God's path is better than our path. Verse number 13 says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that men can find out nothing that will come after him. Consider the work of God. Consider where your life has been and where you believe your life is going, where you believe God intends for you to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. If you're going to finish well, where is God going to lead you through that? He says, who can make straight what God has made crooked? Honestly, when we look at it in the history of Scripture, he says that, God made the world perfect. He made it straight. He made it narrow. He made it beautiful. Life was good up until we screwed it up. We actually are the ones that made it crooked, and God cursed the world, and so that's why we have to deal with all the problems that we have to deal with. If it hadn't been for our sin, we'd still be running around in the garden naked and eating fruit all day, and that sounds pretty good to me most days. But the problem is that's not what life is like for us, because we have killed this world, we have ruined this world, we have twisted this world in so many ways that we're never going to be able to get back there. And so he says, consider what God has done. Consider the path that God has for you to walk. Can anybody make straight what God has made crooked? Your life, your path, the way that you want to go might not be the best way. I said there, God's path is better than your path. Now, if you went out in your car into the parking lot and you aimed your car in any one direction, and you locked up your steering and you just went in one direction, how far do you think you'd go before you'd really seriously break something? Not very far, probably like 100 feet. That'd be about it. And God's path for your life is not straight, it's not narrow, it's not level, it's not easy. And a lot of that we can blame on ourselves. But God says here in the 14th verse, the good days and the bad days, God is in every one of them. God is every bit as much in the good days as he is in the bad days. And Isaiah chapter 55, verse number 8, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. You have no idea where God is leading you. You have no idea what God's got for you around the next corner. But the truth of the matter is that if God is in control of your life, if you place your life in his hands, you've got the best navigator that the world has ever seen, because he knows what's around the next corner. He knows what's around the bend. He knows what's around that next hill. He sees the blind driveway ahead of you. He knows the crazy, stupid drivers that are on the highway. He knows everything that's going on in your life. He knows today. He knows tomorrow. He knows the past. He knows the future. And God has promised that if you place your life in his hands, he's going to take care of you. His path for your life is so much better than your path. And we try to fight God, and we try to make our own way, and we try to make our own path, and no matter what we try to do, we always seem to fall flat on our face, right? Sometimes I wonder with people, how long is it going to take before you start to see the blaring horns and the sirens and everybody else that's on this road that is trying to tell you, hey, you're going the wrong way. Somewhere along the line, we've got to understand that, you know what, I'm messing up, and if I keep on doing this, I'm not going to finish well. I'm not going to get to the end of my life, and people aren't going to have good things to say about me. They might print me up like a circus clown, they might put some perfume on me and some nice clothes, but ultimately, if I keep living my life this way, it's not going to end so well. We need to live our lives in such a way that we understand that finishing well is much more important, that the end is more important than the journey. God's got a purpose for your life, and we need to live in such a way that we understand that purpose and we're living for that purpose. In the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. So do not run aimlessly." I left a couple of words out there just to be able to get it in the sheet of paper here, and go ahead and read it. But that's what he's saying. Do not run aimlessly. If you want to run as though you're obtaining that prize, if you're running as though there is an aim to your life, don't run aimlessly. So many people I see, their life, like I said a minute ago, is not like an Indy 500 as much as it's like a demolition derby, where they're just killing time and trying not to get killed themselves. That's not what God wants us to live like. God gave us life more abundant and free than we could ever imagine, but so few of us actually take advantage of it. And if there's one thing that I can encourage you to do this morning, it's live your life so that you're going to finish well. Look at where you're going to be in 5 years, 10 years. Look at where you want to be, what you want people to say about you at your funeral, and ask yourself, what am I doing today to make that possible? What am I doing today that is going to make that place that God wants me to be, and I want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the day that I die, what am I doing to make that my reality? Because I believe that when God is at your side, anything is possible. I've seen people that have turned their life around and have done things that nobody even could have imagined possible because they trusted Him to make it possible. It's not something that they did in and of themselves. I've seen marriages fixed. I've seen homes that have been repaired. I've seen people that have gone into ministry, people that have never stepped inside the church, and they go on to live a life that is honoring and pleasing to the Lord, and they lead hundreds of souls to Christ. And all things are possible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And if you live your life in such a way where it's not aimless, where you're not just wandering through life, but if you live your life in such a way that you know that God is with you and God is for you and that you can be anywhere, He'll get you there. And that's a promise. Father, I thank